Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Monday the 19th of August in London. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Ukraine's President Zelenskiy reveals the reason behind his forces' surprise incursion into Russia. Britain's property buyers return to the market after an early August rate cut. Plus, just weeks after entering the race for the White House, Kamala Harris prepares to formally accept the Democratic nomination for president. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. President Zelenskiy says the aim of Ukraine's incursion into Russian territory is to create a buffer zone between the two countries. His comments came as Kyiv expanded its operation over the weekend, destroying two key bridges in the Kursk area and disrupting some of Moscow's main supply routes. During his nightly address, Zelensky praised the efforts and also made a direct appeal to the UK, US and France.
In every direction, our troops are doing an outstanding job. However, when it comes to supplies from our partners, we need things to speed up. There are no holidays in war. We need decisions. We need timely logistics for the promised aid packages.
As Zelensky and Kyiv seek to press their advantage, the International Atomic Energy Agency is warning that safety at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is deteriorating. On Saturday, a drone exploded just outside the site's protected area, which has been occupied by Russian soldiers since the early stages of the war. The UK jobs market is now the most competitive for hiring since the COVID-19 lockdowns ended in 2021. Data from the employment site Adzuna shows the number of jobs on offer was up 1.1% in July, the highest in over 3 years. That's the first increase this year and comes as the number of people looking for jobs is also on the rise. The report adds to optimism around Britain's economy after official figures last week saw the unemployment rate unexpectedly drop to 4.2%. Prospective UK home buyers are stepping up their searches in the wake of the Bank of England's first rate cut. That's according to the online property portal Rightmove. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has the details.
Confidence in a stronger autumn for the British housing market is building. That's after the country's first reduction in interest rates since the start of the pandemic earlier this month. Rightmove says the prospect of lower mortgage costs has been enough to prompt 19% more buyers to contact estate agents since the cut. The platform also expects seller asking prices to rise slightly. Following patchy recovery in 2024, the Bank of England's policy pivot might just be what home buyers need to kick off the stronger second half of the year. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
In the United States, the Federal Reserve is approaching a crucial pivot point. Markets will be looking for confirmation policymakers will lower rates in September when Jerome Powell speaks at the central bank's gathering in Jackson Hole later this week. Goldman Sachs chief economist Jan Hatzius says recent economic data has been positive.
The information we've gotten this week has been very encouraging. On the growth side, mostly good news, another drop in jobless claims, and clearly stronger than expected retail sales number. That was very reassuring.
Goldman Sachs' Jan Hatzius speaking there. His team of economists lowered the probability of a US recession from 25% to 20% after last week's retail sales and jobless claims data showed resilience in the US economy. In the US election campaign, Democrats are set to anoint Kamala Harris as their nominee in the National Convention, which begins today in Chicago. The latest poll from ABC News and The Washington Post shows the Vice President now 4 points ahead of Donald Trump. Harris says she's a different kind of leader to the Republican nominee.
There's been this kind of perversion that has taken place, I think, which is to suggest that the measure of the strength of a leader is based on who you beat down, when what we know is the real and true measure of the strength of a leader is based on who you lift up.
Kamala Harris there at a campaign speech in the key swing state of Pennsylvania over the weekend. Donald Trump is planning a blitz of rallies and press events to try to upstage the Democrats. Republican allies have urged the former president to focus on issues like the economy, but so far he has resorted to insulting his opponent. Israel and Hamas are blaming each other for holding up a ceasefire and hostage deal. Fresh objections from both sides are blocking the talks, which diplomats say are closer to an agreement than they have been for months. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says some principles need to be upheld for the country's security.
I want to emphasise that we are conducting negotiations and not that we just give and give. There are things we can be flexible on and there are things we cannot be flexible on, which we will insist on. We know how to distinguish between the two very well.
Benjamin Netanyahu there speaking via translator. Hamas released a statement shortly after talks paused on Sunday, saying Israel had added new demands which would prevent a deal. We hold Netanyahu fully responsible, the statement read. Well, in a moment, we will bring you more on the Russia-Ukraine war, the latest there over the weekend, plus look ahead to the Democratic National Convention in the US. But another story that caught our eye this morning from Bloomberg Opinion's Tyler Cohen, looking at the difficulty of measuring the success of individuals as we're all working in bigger teams, helped, of course, by technology as well. His question is, if something does well, it's often not clear who should get the credit because so many people have been involved in creating it. And he looks at this through the frame of academic papers and how it's becoming more common to publish now with several co-authors. So in that situation, how can you tell who did the most work or the best work? And how can you ascribe any success of the ideas to an individual? He said it's a dilemma that could be exacerbated by AI. So if your work feeds a large language model, it's arguably even more valuable. But then who gets the credit for that? The piece, Are You a Good Employee? Let's Check with the Team by Tyler Cohen is at bloomberg.com/opinion. Let's bring you more now on Ukraine's incursion into Russia. The Ukrainian president now says the goal is to create a buffer zone to prevent further attacks by Moscow. Bloomberg's Tony Halpin leads our team covering economics and government in Russia, and he joins us now. Tony, great to have you on the programme. What is the latest we know about, first of all, what's happening in the Kursk region of Russia, where Ukrainian forces began that incursion almost 2 weeks ago?
Yes, good morning, Stephen. As you've mentioned, Ukrainian forces have said that they've struck two rather significant bridges in a part of the Kursk region that crosses a river that approaches the Ukrainian border, and that's significant because it will probably make it very difficult for Russian forces that are still there to resupply themselves. So that's evidence that Ukrainian troops are still expanding their incursion into Russian territory. Beyond that, Russia is still insisting that it's repelling the incursion, but events on the ground seem to contradict them.
So President Zelenskiy spoke on Sunday for the first time about what the broader aim of this incursion is. What did we learn from him?
Yes, he said that they want to establish a buffer zone to protect Ukrainian communities over the border just inside Ukraine. And as he put it, to continue maximizing counteroffensive actions. I think partly that's a consequence of Ukraine being more confident of the supply of new weaponry that it's receiving from US and European allies. There was a long period earlier this year where that was in doubt because of political wrangling within the US and Europe, but now they seem more confident about that and they're going on the offensive. The irony is, of course, that Russian President Vladimir Putin was calling for a buffer zone inside northern Ukraine to protect the Russian regions of Belgorod and Kursk from attack by Ukrainian drones, and this seems to have boomeranged back upon him.
In terms of the response from Russia, how are we expecting them to play this? What sort of response have they had so far to that incursion by Ukraine?
Yes, well, President Putin is actually visiting Azerbaijan. He's in Baku today and he arrived last night. So they're very much in the Kremlin trying to present an image of business as usual and not drawing attention to this as any sort of crisis. If you look on state television, they're focusing very much on things like the aid being provided to people who fled their homes. And that's already in the hundreds of thousands now, and treating it like some sort of natural disaster rather than a foreign military incursion. And I think part of the reason for that is because they're desperate not to draw attention to the fact that Ukraine apparently managed with some ease to cross into the cross Russia's border.
We've also had this warning, Tony, from the International Atomic Energy Agency about safety at the nuclear plant in Zaporizhzhia, an area occupied by Russian forces. How serious is that situation now?
Yes, this is Europe's biggest nuclear power plant. So it's a very key installation, and what goes on there is a matter of great concern to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And its chief issued a fresh warning about security dangers there because there was a drone explosion close to the last remaining major power line to the plant. And he's calling, this is IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi is calling for, again, all sides to show restraint. And he says he's extremely concerned about what's going on there.
Tony, I want to ask you as well about a report in the German media over the weekend. Apparently that Germany would no longer grant new requests for aid to Ukraine. This is as part of the spending challenges being faced by the German government. What do we know about that report coming from Germany?
Yes, it's important to say they're not cutting off aid. What the issue seems to be about is that their Chancellor is asking for any additional applications that Ukraine makes for military support not to be approved without further consultation. And Germany is busily making the case today and yesterday that it provides billions of dollars of annual aid to Ukraine, and this year something north of $7 billion. But as you say, it's a matter of budget restraints for Germany, and they're trying to ensure that they can have predictable levels of spending, and part of that is the military support for Ukraine. So I think it would probably be a concern for Kiev, but it's not an immediate risk for them.
Okay, Tony Halpin, who leads our team covering economics and government in Russia, thank you very much for joining us with the latest on that. Let's turn to the US election campaign now, which kicks up a gear this week with the Democratic National Convention taking place in Chicago. President Biden will speak later today. Kamala Harris seeking to widen her narrow lead over Donald Trump in the polls. Bloomberg TV anchor Kriti Gupta is with us for more this morning. Morning to you, Kriti. This is a big moment for Kamala Harris's campaign. What does she need to achieve?
Well, she needs to basically get a lot of the independent voters onto her side. And this is a really important moment for the presidential race broadly that you're seeing, because this was the very issue at the heart of President Biden's campaign against President Trump, that basically voters were looking at both candidates saying these are two older white gentlemen, neither of which are appealing on economic policy, foreign policy, or even domestic policy like immigration or abortion, for example, to the broader electorate. This is where Kamala Harris has her advantage. If you look at the latest polling numbers, for example, she has a 49 to 45% advantage. This is according to a Washington Post and ABC News poll released yesterday. That is a pretty big deal and speaks to the fact that she has been able to turn some of the independent voters over to her side. The question, Stephen, is for how long? And that's why this week is so important.
So, of course, that's a national poll that you reference there, but the swing states, of course, as we know in the US system, all the more important. Kamala Harris in Pennsylvania over the weekend trying to do her best to win over voters there. In those key swing state battles, you know, what do we know about Harris's popularity going into this kind of marquee week for her?
Well, so this is where the battleground states are kind of changing in terms of the map, at least. When you talk about some of the swing states, Arizona, North Carolina aren't traditional swing states that we really talk about in previous elections. This time, they could make or break her campaign. And this is really important because these are two states that have seen a lot of federal spending. So Arizona is one example that I think is great. We should remember that she was considering Mark Kelly, the senator out of Arizona, for some time as her VP candidate. And the reason for that is because Arizona is considered traditionally a red state. But for this time around, you've actually seen it be a hub to major manufacturing. Think of the CHIPS Act, think of the Inflation Reduction Act, think of Intel, for example, or Micron building their kind of local American on-soil manufacturing capabilities. That's all happening in Arizona, and so much of that funding has come from the Biden administration and therefore garnered a lot of support in terms of jobs, in terms of economic prosperity for Democrats broadly. And that's kind of some of the tailwinds that she's riding. That's just one example of Arizona. North Carolina is another one. So you're going to see her really push for the story there as well. It's a major financial center in Charlotte, for example. So Piper Sandler, Wells Fargo have two major offices there. This is, again, important because it's reshaping some of these battleground states that traditionally wouldn't matter in previous elections. This time around, basically changing the rules against Donald Trump.
Well, let's talk a bit about how Donald Trump and the Republicans are going to play this week as well. Obviously, the focus very much drawn to Chicago and the DNC, but how should we expect Donald Trump to play this? So already he's put out some pretty headline-worthy comments. For example, talking about just over the weekend deploying the U.S. military in ways for domestic issues, things like immigration, things like domestic crime. He's talking about when there's protests or when there's infighting to deploy the U.S. military on U.S.
U.S. soil. Now, whether or not that's actually going to happen is a completely different story. This is the first time he's mentioned it, though. And this is actually, of course, coming out the heels of Kamala Harris releasing her own economic policy of things like price gouging, etc. Now, the criticism of some of Kamala Harris's policies is that by preventing price gouging on things like grocers or things like insulin providers, a lot of that piggybacking on President Biden's economic policy as well. Are there going to be constraints on supply, or if you go to the more extreme, constraints on capitalism? And that's the very critique that President Donald Trump, or former President Donald Trump, is going to be leaning into when it comes to those kind of attacks, even though his own economic policy isn't quite clear as well. So you want to look for hints in terms of just how sustainable both sides are in terms of really imposing and executing some of the policies that they're actually talking about on the campaign trail.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.